Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another installment in the basic tutorial series, this time around covering hybrid factions. Quick disclaimer before we start, this is not a faction-specific guide. It is focusing on Wood Elves and Norsca, who are the two currently the two what I describe as hybrid factions in the game. And going over some of the differences in playing them compared to playing a standard faction such as Empire of Vampires or a Horde faction like Beastmen and Chaos, and how they implement aspects of both of those factions and what you really have to look out for when playing as them. Just focusing on the basics and seeking to kind of help you guys out with what things to prioritize, and that's some general rules for playing a hybrid faction in the campaign. So without further ado, we're just going to dive straight in. Now, what is a hybrid faction? Of course, probably some of you guys are wondering. I'd describe it simply as a faction that does have a home base on the map. So, in the case of the Wood Elves, it's Athelloren over here, and in the case of Norsca, can't even draw. In the case of Norsca, it's obviously Norsca. This is a bit of a. I opened up a save here that is a little bit older, so it is before Norsca hit. But obviously, I'll be simply be going over rules, so nothing too important there. So first and foremost, of course, I think is econ, and econ is something that really is a critical issue, I think, for most factions in this game. Really, actually, all factions in this game. If you have the money to field armies, you're set. If you don't, well, you're in deep trouble. So hybrid factions have the benefit of having a home base, which does mean that they can generally field more factions than a horde faction, or more armies than a horde faction, because they can counteract at least some of their upkeep with taxes. They can get taxes from their home base settlements, and of course they can. Both factions can get some minor expansions all over the map. In the case of Norsca, they can occupy capitals at Kislev, Koron, Altdorf, Drakenhof, Karazakarak, Black Crag, and I do believe Miragliano. Whereas, and then they can occupy all coastal settlements. The Wood Elves can occupy any settlement on the map, and that gives them an outpost there, which provides a very small amount of income. Obviously, this is nowhere near enough income to field the amount of armies you really need to be fielding to be conquering the world, especially because you actually have to defend parts of the map. You actually have to defend parts of the map. You have a home base that needs some protection. You don't be zoning your opponents away from, unlike a horde faction, of course, simply to make things more efficient, if at all possible. So how do you get extra income? Well, both factions, unlike the two horde factions and orcs, in fact, can trade, which is definitely a significant boost. Or definitely a nice boost. I wouldn't call it significant, because it's limited. Seriously, Norsca is hated by practically every faction in the game, and that means nobody except other Norskins are really willing to trade with you. And unfortunately for the player, you're usually fighting the Norskins to confederate them, so they're not going to be trading with you either. In the case of the Wood Elves, you can't trade with non-elvish factions until you've gotten a specific building for it, and generally, by that time, there's only a few factions to trade with. By the time you do get your trade established, you've usually confederated all the elves by that time. And because it's honestly not that valuable to put up structures that let you to get unique resources for the Wood Elves, it's much better to invest in either foraging groves or the what are they called? Sacrificial grounds, because that's usually much more useful for the Wood Elves. It simply means that you're not getting much out of trade in either case. So definitely not something to concern yourself with too much, but it is a nice little boost, or it can be a nice little boost in some stages of the game. Definitely a nice thing to keep in mind. So how else can you make money? Well, raiding is obviously an option. It's an option for all factions, and Norsca in particular is really built around it. Norsca can enter raiding camp stance just like orcs. And furthermore, can raid when moving at max speed. They can, or moving in normal walking stance. If they move in march stance, obviously can't raid out at the end of it. But with normal stance, they can move full distance and then still be capable of raiding. So that is a very huge potential boost to their income. They can easily make about 1,000 plus a turn on each army. So that is something you should invest in. Now, what other ways can you build up your economy? Well, the most important way really is raiding, razing, and sacking, and looting. Wood Elves raise settlements for money. Norskins sack them for money. Obviously, Norskins can still raise them for one of the to get favors for one of their gods. And then there's after battle, there's battlefield loot and sacrificing slash or releasing troops. And this is obviously the same mechanic, it's just different titles for it. The releasing and sacrificing mechanic is actually very, very useful for both Wood Elves and norsca, because neither suffers any penalties for it. Most other factions will suffer some sort of penalty. Obviously, Bretonnia suffers chivalry penalties. A lot of other factions will suffer a replenishment loss when they release enemy troops, which can be something important to consider when you're releasing them. This is not the case for Wood Elves or norsca. It's very much a one-way street in your favor. Furthermore, the battlefield loot you can get is immense, especially once you start teching into abilities for it. And amount of money you can make from raising and sacking settlements can easily go into the the five-digit count, and you can easily be making somewhere between 10 and 50,000 for most of the settlements you sack or raise. And this will really become your main source of income as the game progresses, allowing you to raise armies very quickly, to sustain your armies in the field, and that sort of stuff. Now, don't be afraid of entering negatives. Much like a Horde faction, you might spend a decent amount of the game entering negatives, and you need to overcome this simply by staying constantly on the move, constantly raiding, raising, and sacking enemy settlements. So you just have to constantly stay on the move to keep your money flowing in. The other option, or well, not the other option, but the other way to reduce your upkeep is obviously reduction in upkeep. This will help you with your economy. Wood Elves do have the Oak of Ages for this. Norskins have skills for it, as well as a specific building chain for it that reduces only by upkeep by only 1% for each army. But of course, this will, with multiple armies on the field, this will be a much bigger boost. And of course, you can stack it by building multiples of these buildings. And and you should really build this structure in practically every province in every region, really, if possible, unless there's a unique economic building. In some cases, with norsca, you can build a first dash, say an obsidian mine, and and have a harbor. In that case, you should leave those three alone and not worry about the 1% upkeep, because it won't give you as much income. But usually, so it won't help you with income as much. But otherwise, especially not in early game. But otherwise, that is definitely a very significant source. That is definitely a significant source of cutting your losses as far as economy goes. It's reducing upkeep, and you can also invest in skills on your lords, especially for norsca, that sort of stuff. Now, moving into the issue of constantly staying on the move, raising, raiding, and sacking everything. That is best settled by investing a lot in replenishment. Both norsca and Wood Elves can have, unlike Horde factions who really struggle with replenishment, outside of the Beastmen, though supposedly Chaos got a buff for that recently, and Beastmen can utilize the Moore's Leap or the Moon event to kind of counteract that, somewhat sporadically. Wood Elves and norsca can maintain consistently high replenishment rates by investing in skills for it. They can get up to 15% boost just with Lord skills, and they have technology for it. They have built. They have some structures that will slightly, I do believe, that will slightly improve it. They can build. I would build in your forward bases, in your either your occupied capitals and your forwards and your coastal settlements for norsca, or just your forward bases or your forward outposts for the Wood Elves. I would invest in the Waystones and the Norscan structures for improved replenishment, because you want to keep your armies in the field constantly, as constantly as you possibly can. Constantly moving forward, much like a Horde faction. You're constantly moving place to place, maybe spending a turn, or at most spending like a handful of turns of downtime as you replenish, and then striking out again. You can't afford to waste so much time staying still, because your income will start draining away, usually, and that's just something you can't accept. So you're basically stuck in a never-ending quest of conquest. So that makes replenishment very crucial. And the other aspect of replenishment is, of course, replacements. Norsca has absolutely atrocious global recruitment. Wood Elves do not. So for Wood Elves, you can global recruit in one turn for the vast majority of units. There's only once you get the tech for it. There's only 3 units for the Wood Elves that don't instantly recruit, and that is, or don't have one turn recruit, and that is Sisters of the Thorn, Tree Men, and Forest Dragons. Which, as long as you have the money, and you should have the money if you're on top of your investments into sacking and raising, this means you can simply keep your army afloat for all eternity. For Norskins, you have to be a little more careful. And yeah, for Norskins you have to be a little more careful. And that's because their global recruit is absolutely atrocious. It's something like 3 turns, I think, for basic units, and that it can ultimately be 7 for the very largest units. And that can be reduced by a very tiny amount, but nothing significant. Now, how do Norskins recruit then on the fly? Well, you can, by occupying settlements, you can get some local recruitment, and also by occupying the capitals, which are honestly very nicely spaced out all around the map. Like Altdorf, Drakenhof, they're very conveniently located. Cologne. You can recruit new units there, and you should definitely invest in some recruiting structures in these settlements, or in these these occupied capitals, just to boost up your replacement of any casualties you might have. Otherwise, just play it a little more cautiously with norsca, and make sure to replenish your units constantly. Once again, replenishment is really the key to this, more so than instant replacement, since you shouldn't be losing units too much in the first place. But nonetheless, a welcome benefit. Then there's the issue of now. From there, obviously, we've discussed how to strike out into the world a bit, how to maintain your armies in the field. So we're going to discuss some homekeeping and early game expansion issues and that sort of stuff. So first and foremost, of course, control. Control is a major issue for both Norsca and Wood Elves. Norsca requires a certain amount of corruption, or functions much like vampires with corruption. And if you do not have a high enough corruption, your control will be absolutely abysmal. Furthermore, and this is not really an issue in Norsca proper, but this will become an issue in your southern settlements. So Norsca has once you manage to put down the other Norscan tribes and get them under control, because Norsca has much better control structures. And this is actually, honestly, I'm going to say this out right here. Norsca and Wood Elves in some ways when some of the mechanics, the way they suffer, are inverted to each other. Norsca suffers much larger issues with control in its settlements and expansions, whereas Wood Elves suffer immensely in their home territory and have no problems whatsoever in their expansions. But early on, both will suffer some incursions inside their home bases. Now, Norsca needs to counteract this by a few ways. First of all, growth. If you need to grow quickly and level up your settlements. When your settlements hit tier 3, they'll be providing +2 public order. And you can further improve your capital, of course, to tier 5, which should improve public order by 3. Build an additional building that improves public order. Norsca does have that option. And you can bring your public order up to a very solid, very solid amount, fairly easily. Wood Elves don't quite have this luxury. They can counteract control issues a little bit with public order technology. Sorry about that. They have a specific building that can counteract public order issues a little bit, the Sculptor's Cavern. But it will not be enough to counteract the -8 penalty on very hard, or the corruption penalties that you'll start suffering once the chaos invasion event starts happening, and all these sorts of issues. So how do you counteract it? Well, the solution is, 1, the tree of the Oak of Ages needs to be leveled up, and that, of course, requires more campaigning. And the other solution is constantly stationing an army in your home base, or at least part of an army, or possibly using heroes to counteract the unhappiness. And both Norsca and Wood Elves make much more use of heroes, I think, than either Chaos or Beastmen. Obviously, the Gorbel is very strong, Wizards are very strong, very useful, all that sort of stuff, but you will not be using your heroes as much on the campaign trail, I think, as Norskins and Wood Elves will. You can use Branch Wraiths or Werkin to help stiffen up your public order, especially early on when it's absolutely crucial to keep it up high with both Norsca and Wood Elves, when you still haven't quite built up. You can reduce your cost of producing buildings, of course, with Wizards, with the Spellslinger and the Wizard for Chaos, or the Sorcerer. And you can improve your growth with your Lords. Not necessarily your heroes, but your lords. And of course, assassinate enemy heroes who try to spread corruption, that sort of stuff in your territory. So that's something to look out for. Make sure you make use of heroes. And that's basically it for the issue of using heroes and the issue of control. Make sure to invest in growth a little bit. For what else you can build up your growth through Isha the Mother. I would not really invest in either in the growth or replenishment buildings for Wood Elves. They're not really worthwhile. It's much better to simply invest in the growth technology early game and simply rely on that. Casualty replenishment in your home base is simply pointless, in my opinion, for Wood Elves. It's much more useful in the field than yourself. And this is true for both norsca and Wood Elves. The casualty replenishment is much more important out in the field than it is in your home territory once you've pacified your home territory. Now, once again, going to that inverse, just like Wood Elves have much more issues controlling their home turf, with maintaining control in their home turf than the Norskins do, and the Norskins have more issues controlling their settlements outside of their outposts than the Wood Elves have their outposts, which cause no trouble at all. Because you get massive public order buffs for each outpost. There's another inverse with the expansion, and that is that Wood Elves spend most of the early game beating up on one of their neighbors, and this sometimes can be Norsca if you play as Durthu, because he's immune to attrition, his army's immune to attrition. Otherwise, it can potentially be the Dwarves, not recommended, and more likely than not, it's going to be the Bretonnians and the Stallions and the Tillians, the easy cannon fodder Empire-derived or Bretonnia factions. Farming Ember to get the better technologies, as well as to level up your tree to a point where you can simply confederate all of Athelor in the space of about 10 turns. For Norsca, and then you can be much less cautious and really strike out into the world with multiple armies at the same time. That is usually where you spike with the amount of armies you're capable of fielding. Norsca, in comparison, spends basically the entire early game, probably the first 40, 50, maybe 60 turns, confederating Norsca. Obviously, if you feel comfortable with it, there are alternatives to this. You don't necessarily have to play like this, but it is definitely recommended. And once you've confederated all of Norsca, that is when you really you should be getting enough income to truly strike out, and to really once you've confederated all of Norsca, you should really have the income to strike out into the base of operations, the buildings you need, and just enough income to field enough to build up enough armies to start striking out into the world. So there's a bit of an inverse there, but both factions really need to confederate their home base to start launching major campaigns into the world. Neither can really simply function as a horde where you just take your one army or your one stack and just roam around. Potentially you could, but realistically it's simply not that. It's not as useful as simply maxing out your home province and working from there. And that really is what that I think is really it for hybrid factions. Hybrid factions, like I said, they get a lot of the benefits of both normal factions and there's, I guess, the issue of defense. And the issue of defense is once again another split here. With Wood Elves, it's not a bad idea, especially on your front line or places where there's often beastmen spawns, that sort of stuff. It's not a bad idea to build fortifications. And in your home territory, it's a very good idea to build fortifications because you tend to have issues with control there. And the elf fortifications are incredibly powerful. Elves, despite not having walls, are probably one of the, and neither of the two hybrid factions has walls, but elves, despite not having walls, have probably one of the best defensive setups in the game. Honestly, I would rather defend Waterfall Palace or King's Lake or whatever with the full fortification structures than maxed out Altdorf or Karazakarak or whatever, because the elves are just that good on defense. As long as you're on top of your micro and your skirmish units, they are absolutely brutal. Norsca, not so much. Norsca can potentially get decent fortifications, but because they're a very melee-oriented faction, they can't Vanguard deploy really, so they can't cheese their way to wins, that sort of stuff. It's not really worthwhile to build up defenses in Norsca. Simply rely on your armies to defend. In the worst case, you will lose some settlements to razing, and you can always recover those later and rebuild properly once you've crushed all the Norskins. You will sometimes lose some settlements along the way, but that's okay. So I would never really invest in. And if you're worried about investing in defenses, for Wood Elves, it's very worthwhile to build Waystones, and that is because it not only does it give you an extra garrison, but it also gives you a massive boost to casualty replenishment rate. And this is especially useful when you're pushing out into the enemy's territory, and you simply need to constantly keep that replenishment up. But the garrison aspect of it isn't that important. For the Norskins, I would say it's a similar issue. I wouldn't really invest in the garrison buildings for their settlements. Usually, you will have an army nearby initially, and by the time your army's moved away, there'll basically be a dead zone of raised territory that your enemies won't really be going through to attack your coastal settlement. So it's not something to concern yourself about too much, in my opinion. Much better to simply put economic buildings, put replenishment buildings, and that sort of stuff in the settlement for norsca. Put buildings that build up corruption so that you can avoid uprisings and insurrections. So that really covers it, I think, for Wood Elves and norsca for the two hybrid factions, as far as the very basics go. Economy needs to be built up in all its aspects. Invest in your home-based economy for both factions. It is worthwhile. It can counteract at least a handful of your armies on the field. Don't be worried about entering negative state. Do try to reduce your upkeep at all costs, and do try to improve your income through all ways that you possibly can, whether that be raising, raiding, looting, sacking, whatever that may be. Invest in it. This game does revolve around economy. This is how norsca and the Wood Elves economy ticks. Do make use of heroes. They can help you immensely with growth, with counteracting corruption, with counteracting public disorder, with all those sorts of things. They get with assassinating heroes, all that sort of stuff, as well as, of course, the general army boosts and army support they provide. Do make sure to confederate your main territory before you really strike out deep into the world. You will be thankful for that decent core of income and a decent core of production structures, for sure. It is very useful to have, whether you're Wood Elves or norsca. So never overlook it. Never just simply play just as a horde. It's not necessarily it's not really the way these factions should be played out. Fortify as Wood Elves. Don't fortify as norsca. Play very aggressively, constantly on the move. Make sure you have replenishments. You have invested a lot in replenishment. Try to get buildings to either quickly replace losses or just global recruit. In the case of the Wood Elves, make sure you have that economy. Once again, it all comes down to economy, replacing your losses. So that is basically it for this combined guide. It is like I said, it's a very basic, very general guide. It is not meant to provide you with the full rundown of every nitpicky aspect of how to play Wood Elves and norsca. I will be releasing full faction guides for them and their sub-factions eventually. For now, this is going to be the last basics guide I will be publishing until the release of Warhammer, or as far as definitely for the factions in this game, unless we get either a new DLC or until Warhammer 2 comes out. This is the last general sort of information, this kind of general tutorial. I do hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, and if you found it helpful, be sure to leave a like or subscribe down below. I definitely appreciate that. Also, be sure to leave, if you have any ideas, comments, suggestions, anything you think I missed, or anything that you think I could be made better in making this sort of general guide. Do be sure to post it. I do read the comments. I will respond as soon as I can. I do take your guys' input very seriously. I like to improve these videos so that I can help people as well as possible. These guides are meant to be helpful ultimately. So any little bit of information, any idea matters, and I do definitely appreciate those things. So definitely be sure to comment, critique, suggest things, and I'll be sure to read them and respond as soon as I can. Especially as I progress with my future faction guides. Once again, guys, I appreciate you all for watching. I hope you found this useful. Hope you found it informative. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.